Well, welcome everybody. My name is Shawn Casey. I teach Christian ethics at Wesley Theological Seminary, and I'm a member here at Florence United Methodist Church. And I'm so pleased you decided to come out this evening to talk some about the Christian moral life. I want to draw you kind of a quick map of where I want to go tonight and where we're going to go the next 2 weeks as well. We're going to look tonight at how do we as Christians react to the moral pluralism that we encounter in our world today. As you know, if you're paying any attention at all, probably on your own block, but certainly within Fairfax County or the wider Washington, D.C. area, there's now an astonishing array of moral worldviews out there that are different from our own. And that's not the way it was when I was a child. And so one of the first questions in Christian ethics comes is, how do we respond in light of that? What impact does that have? Thank you so much, Cheryl. I'm going to need this later on. And so tonight we're going to be exploring really what has changed. We're going to talk a little bit about the texture and complexity of the moral pluralism we experience in our own country. And then I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds of Christian responses to that moral complexity. And I really want this to be interactive. So we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for your questions. But if any point along the way I say something that you find interesting, that you find just incredibly stupid or incredibly mysterious, please shoot your hand up. There's a lot of educational research today that shows that when you interact with a teacher or you interact with texts, if we had read a text together, you actually retain more information in memory if you actually participate rather than sitting there in a passive fashion. I wish we had a little less distance between us, and so I may actually move around a fair amount, and that's going to tax our videographer tonight, but that's okay. He's a professional. He can do that. And then next week, I'm going to take a specific moral issue and look at the question of war and peace and spend some time reflecting not only on the history of Christian teaching about war and peace, but I'm going to try to give you a practical set of tools through which or by which you can evaluate specific armed conflicts that perhaps have arisen in our lifetime or may inevitably arise later on. And this will give you an example of how, as ethicists, we try to look at specific cases. Now, that's not all we do as ethicists, but I would be remiss over the course of 3 or 4 weeks looking at Christian ethics if we don't sort of look at a case and think about how, as Christians, do we approach it. And war is certainly a very complex one. And that's a case that's very close to the bone. Here, as you know, we've been in 2 wars in the last decade, and there's been a lot of argument, maybe not a lot of moral reflection, but I think this would be a good sort of test case. And then 2 weeks from tonight, I'm going to look at this concept of sanctification, which is one of those marvelously old-fashioned sounding words, and yet it's very much at the heart of the Wesleyan tradition. John Wesley himself has some wonderful things to say about how we, as disciples of Jesus Christ, become holy. How does God transform us into holy people? And we're going to look at a sermon or 2 of Wesley's. We're going to look at some biblical material. And we're going to try to reflect practically how we as Christians today move more towards a holy lifestyle and away from an unholy lifestyle. So that's, in a sense, a look at personal ethics. Next week is more of a test case of what we call social ethics, but today we're reflecting on what do we make of this bewildering array of moral options and life worlds and lifestyles that we seem to be confronting a growing complexity of on just a regular basis. So how should Christians live in a morally confused age? How should we think about and talk about things like war? What does sanctification mean? I also put in the teaser, why are the Redskins not God's chosen team? I'm not going to answer that one tonight, okay? We're going to hold the mystery for a couple more weeks. But we're going to look at those and some other issues along the way, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So tonight we're asking the question, what is going on in contemporary ethics? And we're going to look at this proliferation of moral worldviews in our society. Some people say that we have transferred from one age to a new age. You've heard of the modern era, and if you can remember back to your college history days, modernity began either in the European Renaissance or perhaps the age of the Reformation back in the 15th or 16th century. And I grew up being taught, I was growing up in the modern age. Now, if you hear a lot of contemporary commentators, some people use the language of post-modernity, which is a really bizarre kind of term. When you think of post-modernity, that means after modernity. It doesn't really tell you what you are, it tells you what you are no longer. Okay? So we talk about the post-teenage years. What does it mean to be 23 years old? Well, we're not really sure, but we're sure you're not in high school or junior high anymore. We talk about the post-Cold War era. We know we're not in the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. That's past. But we haven't really come up with a good description of what we really are in. So this language of post-modernity or post-Cold War, it's, I think, a reflection of the confusion that we're in. We're pretty certain we're not back there anymore. But nobody can really describe where we are now. It's like we're not in Kansas anymore. We know that. We're in a post-Kansas world, as Dorothy observed to Toto. But she wasn't really sure where she was. She was in Oz, that very strange place. And in many ways, post-modernity is a form of Oz. We have left the normalcy of Kansas, but we're in this bizarre world now where houses fall out of the sky and witches have houses land on them and flying monkeys are around us. And we can be very disoriented because many of the things we took for granted in the 50s and at least in the early 60s can no longer be taken for granted. And that can be very, very disorienting, particularly then when you think about introducing children into this postmodern world where the truths that seem to be so self-evident in my childhood years didn't always work when talking to my two children, now one 23 and the other 18. They have grown up in a world radically different from what I had to face. My wife Ann and I had this sort of awakening moment when we reflected on that year between 9/11 and the sniper. I'm sure you all remember that quite well. And I can remember dropping my son off at Franklin Middle School when it was still dark, and watching him run to the door. And watching in that kiss and ride lane, hundreds of kids running as fast as they could in the dark with their backpacks bouncing on their backs. And I realized when I was 13, I never had to deal with things like that. We didn't have to deal with teenage suicide. We didn't have to deal with AIDS and things like that. So our children have grown up with a vastly different moral background than what I grew up in, in fact, in the last millennium when I was 13. It's a much more complicated and difficult world. Now, the academic field of Christian ethics is a very bizarre world, and I'm here to try and interpret part of that world to you. I liken it to contemporary television. I was in a motel recently with not a lot to do, and I spent, unbeknownst to me, 45 minutes just going round and round and round. And I finally realized, my thumb was hurting, and I literally didn't stay on a single channel more than 30 seconds. And after I'd gone through like 8 times, something finally clicked in my head. None of these choices are very good. So even in ethics today, we have lots of options in programming, but not necessarily a lot of high-quality stuff. So what I've tried to do is choose what I hope you find to be fairly high quality and not arbitrary, but hopefully relevant to you and relevant to your own Christian life. Now, many of my students come into ethics class wanting arguments over issues. They think that I'm going to come in and say, okay, tonight's topic is abortion, or tonight's topic is war, and they want me to carry 3 signs, one that says yes, one that says no, and maybe one that says maybe. And at the end of an hour, they want me to hold up yes, no, or maybe. And they get frustrated with me when I don't approach every class with just my 3 signs. I try to say it's more complicated than that. And sometimes they come away frustrated because they want to know yes and no answers that they can put on or write on an exam. So they view ethics as what we call conundrum ethics. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And that ethics professors are supposed to be able to answer those kind of stump the Messiah questions in 10 words or less. Well, let me warn you at the outset, I'm not a Messiah, nor am I an expert on marital arrangements in the life to come. And I don't carry just 3 signs with me, yes, no, and maybe. But I do have some hopes for our time together. First of all, I hope you will learn something about the Christian moral life. I hope as a result of burning these precious hours, which you could spend in 1,000 different ways besides what you're doing here, that you come up with some, I hope, clear answers on some issues. And tonight I want to give you an account of how we should comport ourselves against this vastly complicated background. It was quite different from what many of us grew up with. Next time we're going to talk about this notion of how as Christians we analyze war, and then as I said, in 2 weeks we're going to look at how we are transformed by God into kingdom people. That is, our lives will reflect the moral imprint of our Maker. That's what I'm going to try and argue in 2 weeks. And the wonderful term there is sanctification. I was raised in a very small town of 25,000 people in western Kentucky by the name of Paducah. Now, when I first met my wife, she thought I was making that up, and then I was kidding her that I really grew up in a town named Paducah. But let me assure you, it is there. It's in the western part of Kentucky. But in that small town of 25,000 people in the decade of the 60s when I grew up, there was a pretty strong moral consensus from the east end of town to the west end of town. If the clergy of First Baptist, Broadway United Methodist Church, First Presbyterian, Temple Israel, and the Broadway Church of Christ agreed on an issue, it was pretty much settled. No discussion. If 5 or 6 people at the head of those churches said, this is good, that is bad, that was the moral consensus that we lived by. Now, at the beginning of the 60s, there was then a broad moral consensus that held fast, and everybody sort of pretended that's the way it had always been, even though it probably wasn't true. It always helps your moral position to say, well, we've always done it that way, and that was what I heard growing up. But at the beginning of the 60s, by the time you get to the middle of the 1960s, that moral consensus had begun to erode on a number of fronts. Now, for instance, none of the clergy of those churches would have questioned whether it was right to go to war to fight the communist threat. That was a universal threat that everybody saw. None of us had met a Muslim, much less welcomed one to the town. There were no Muslims living in Paducah, Kentucky in the 1960s. The Mormons hadn't even built a building yet. They came in the 1960s. And the Pentecostals pretty much lived on the wrong side of the Illinois Central train tracks that ran from New Orleans to Chicago, right? They were there, but they didn't get a vote much at the consensus building exercises in our town. And the village atheists could have met in the phone booth, assuming they were brave enough to identify themselves as atheists. But by the end of the decade, that consensus was already fraying. Now think about it. There were no African American churches on that list of consensus. They lived in a segregated world. The public schools where I grew up didn't desegregate until about 1967 or 1968. Which is astonishing. I tell my children now about being in the 4th grade when we desegregated, and they look at me like, you grew up on planet Earth? They just couldn't conceive of that universe. But I remember it like it was yesterday when suddenly my all-white school went to being racially integrated. Now, we take that for granted today, but that was part of the consensus through the mid-60s, that you had separate but allegedly equal school districts. Now, when I go back to visit my now 91-year-old mother in Paducah, Kentucky, I hardly recognize the place because that old moral consensus that was established by a handful of religious leaders is gone. So what are we to make of this sea change in the West, this lack of moral consensus and this proliferation of moral worldviews? A little over 30 years ago, a cranky Scottish philosopher with the wonderful name Alasdair MacIntyre wrote a very provocative and influential account of the moral pluralism of our world in this book, After Virtue. I want to read to you a passage that is a very compelling vision of what has gone on in our world today. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur, laboratories are burned down, physicists are lynched, books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there's a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they've largely forgotten what it was. But all they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance, parts of theories unrelated to either to other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experimental instruments whose use have been forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because they're torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory. That's my favorite. Although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each, children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite its incantations, some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all, for everything that they do and says conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence. And those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. In such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in a systematic and often interrelated ways, which would resemble, in lesser or greater degrees, the ways in which such expressions had been used in the earlier times before scientific knowledge had been so largely lost. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness and even of choice in their application, which would appear very surprising to us. And so he goes on, and then he says, this imaginary world is very much like one some science fiction writers have constructed. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or parts of it at least, continues to be used, but is in such a grave state of disorder. Now, what's the purpose, he asks, of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists in real philosophy, real moral philosophy? The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality or ethics is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world in which I described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess, indeed, tokens of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. That's an astonishing claim. Think about that. Now, he wrote this in 1980, 30 years ago, claiming that that's really all we have. And he goes on to say that the barbarians are no longer at the door. Basically, the barbarians have taken over our world from a moral perspective. Now, let me hasten to add, I think he's wrong. But the fact that we can listen to this description and say it's worth entertaining, and that an Oxford-educated scholar can make a compelling case and write 260-some-odd pages arguing that thesis that has been highly influential in philosophy and in Christian ethics today, isn't itself sobering. that when we talk about ethics and right and wrong and goodness and virtues and rules and goals, we absolutely have no common vocabulary left. We're just walking around kind of like in Fahrenheit 451, if you remember that movie, where people are walking around having memorized books, but they really don't talk much to each other. His argument is we can't talk to each other. And that's the state of moral discourse in the West today. Now, while I think he exaggerates and overstates the fact, he may at least tap into some of the anxiety that perhaps we have felt at times as we've gone through our lives and we've bumped into our neighbors and we've read the newspaper and we see what's going on in the world. We feel very confused because what seemed to be a moral consensus for many of us in that small town world that at least I came from, that world no longer exists. And as Christians, we're left puzzled and we're left dizzy. Now, what's his prescription? I will save you having to read 263 pages of philosophy. I will jump to the end and read for you what I take to be a very unsatisfactory conclusion. It is always dangerous, this is his last paragraph, it is always dangerous to draw too precise parallels between one historical period and another. And among the most leading of such parallels are those which have been drawn between our age in Europe and North America and the epoch in which the Roman Empire declined into the Dark Ages. Nonetheless, certain parallels there are. A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that world. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained so that both morality and civility might survive the coming age of barbarism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we ought also to conclude that for some time now, we too have reached that turning point. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And he goes on to say that we have simply to wait for the emergence of another Saint Benedict, which led Europe out of the Dark Ages into modernity. Now that's a very dark picture. And I give it to you not because I'm commending it, but simply to say there are people who've experienced what you've experienced and I've experienced at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, and to come away saying, we're in the new dark ages because we have so many different moral worldviews. We have forgotten what led us to our best angels. And all we can do is hunker down and wait for a better time to come. Now, that's deeply pessimistic, and I think that overstates the case. But I think it taps some of the angst that we often feel, that the moral world has changed so much and it's so complicated we don't recognize it. And maybe all we can do is step back and wait for something new to emerge. So let me start you off with that kind of dark theory, that dark thesis. Now, I don't embrace that. Even though I will grant we have seen this explosion of moral worldviews, I'm not selling what Mr. McIntyre is selling. I'm not asking you to buy that today, but it's a very sobering and powerful picture that's had tremendous impact on a lot of ethicists in the West today. Now, is this really what Christians are called to do in the face of this complexity? Hunker down and wait for another St. Benedict? Now, a very different account has come recently from a Christian Canadian political philosopher named Charles Taylor. And again, ethicists write large books, okay? We can't clear our throats in 100 pages. It takes us 800 pages to really make the whole case. Now, the good news is I'm here to give you the skinny, if you will. And in this wonderful book, A Secular Age, now when I get to be 83, I hope they let me write an 800-page book. Mr. Taylor could have used an editor. This is a glorious mess of a book, but when you reach his stature, editors stay away. Editors don't get invited into these large career-capping projects. But I'm such a nerd. I read this book with 10 of my graduate students over the course of one semester. We had a one-hour reading course where all you do is come and we read about 75 pages a week. And I was in absolute ecstasy. I'm not sure my 10 students would share that view. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting, complex, and compelling case. And what he tries to do is he starts with a thesis. In the 15th century, everybody in the West believed in God. You couldn't find an atheist. Or you couldn't find an atheist who would admit they were an atheist, because the dominant view was there is a God, and everybody sort of believed that. He said, how did we get from that at the beginning of modernity to where we are today, where we all know people who don't believe in God, and we don't find that shocking, do we? I mean, you go to work and somebody tells you over the water cooler, you know, I grew up X, Y, or Z, but today I'm just not sure. That does not shock us, because there's so many folks for whom belief in God is difficult, if not impossible. So how did we get from where everybody believes and nobody doubts it to a world where, in fact, it's routine that we bump into people who either don't believe or have severe doubts? How did we get from one to the other? Now, again, I'm not going to give you the 800-page journey of his account, but he gives us some interesting answers that I think are helpful. One of the first things he says is he uses the metaphor of how a star goes into a nova stage and then supernova, where it explodes and expands. He said that's really what's happened in terms of the number of moral options. And think about our universe today. Pick up a Washington Post. Pick up any trade magazine and monitor it for a year and ask yourself to count the number of moral options, the different kinds of lifestyles that are commended or espoused by somebody writing in those magazines or writing in the newspaper. You can't keep count. You literally can't keep count today of the options that we have as believers or lack of believers, as trying to be moral people or less moral people. The flavors, it's beyond Baskin-Robbins' 33 flavors. It has proliferated now where the number is too high for anybody to count. But nevertheless, Taylor makes some interesting observations. He talks about the moral revolution that has occurred in our lifetime. And part of that revolution is the fact that we now believe in things like universal human rights. If NBC News, ABC News, CNN, and CBS all run a story tonight about innocent civilians being killed in the city of Aleppo or Damascus in Syria, we come away thinking different things about that than even people did 40 years ago. We think today somebody needs to stop that. Somebody needs to do something about that. In my childhood, we would have seen that video and we would have said, that's horrible. I'm really sorry those people are suffering. That's tragic. But it would not have occurred to most people to say, somebody needs to do something about that. So he argues that even in like the last 20, 30, 40 years, we have made an interesting progression, even though we come from different moral orientations, to say somebody ought to do something about that. That is not right. That innocent people are being directly targeted by military folk. And so he argues we've had a bit of a shift here. Despite our moral diversity, there is this universal concern with human rights. That if despots are attacking minorities within their own country, we have a responsibility to do something about that. And we get angry and frustrated when our governments and international organizations don't seem to have a quick and easy answer to that. So despite, in Taylor's argument, the proliferation of worldviews, it's not that we have 6 billion people and 12 billion opinions on every issue. There actually are some issues around which we seem to have a growing consensus that we do have responsibility, particularly in the face of huge natural disasters or wars. And he just finds that very interesting, that there are actually some good things that have gone on morally despite this proliferation of worldviews. And I find that to be a compelling account. Let me read to you a selection here that gets at this. So he begins to talk about what does religion look like then in this world of supernova, where there are an astonishing array of options today, instead of just sort of the chocolate, vanilla, strawberry options of my childhood or perhaps yours. He talks about spirituality has replaced religion in the lives of many people. Perhaps you know people who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. You'll know people who have no affiliation with organized religion or church or synagogue or even mosque, but they will defend the fact that they are spiritual, but they've separated themselves from religious community. So we've decoupled, many of our fellow citizens have decoupled religious belief from membership in religious community. He says the feature of spirituality is what he calls its subjectivism. Its focus on the self and its wholeness, with an emphasis on feeling. And it's led many to see new forms of spiritual quest that arise in our society. Some see it as trivial and privatized. Taylor says, I believe that this is part and parcel of a common era, which is a widespread propensity to identify this main phenomenon of our age as the age of authenticity with its most simple and flattened forms. It's very easy to dismiss people who just talk about their spirituality disconnected from community. He thinks that's a mistake. He thinks people who are expressing this are onto something very real and very deep and very personal, and it's a mistake, particularly for Christians, to be too quickly dismissive of this phenomenon of the spiritual but not religious. And he says this kind of flattening effect arises out of the polemics where critics on the one hand and boosters of the trivialized forms on the other really reduce each other's arguments and produce kind of a simplified, distorted view. I call this the talk show effect. Forgive me, and if this sounds cranky, like a cranky middle-aged man, I'll cop to that. But when you see three people on a couch, on a TV set, trying to explain their spirituality, it almost always comes off trivial, at least in my experience. And maybe that's because theologians like myself aren't very good at that format. But nevertheless, the market has reduced religion and spirituality to its cheapest forms on television, and it's easy to caricature that. I'm not so sure that's an effective strategy with your neighbor who tells you, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And if we mock that, if our reaction is cynicism, that doesn't build a very good relationship with the next door neighbor, to say the least. But he believes then that there is actually something afoot in this movement, and part of it is actually the fault of the religious institutions. That people now come into religious institutions and they look around and they sample and they taste and they spend a few minutes and they say, you know what, this does nothing for me. And then they move on. So for those of us in religious institutions and churches, it's easy to kind of point a finger at them and say, well, you're really not very serious if you can't hang around here and get the benefit I get from it. But that's not a particularly loving or deep Christian response to those people. It's dismissive, and it doesn't take them seriously. So one of the most interesting things going on today is the rise of the unaffiliated. Do you know that the fastest growing demographic of people in our country with respect to religious affiliation is the unaffiliated? The nuns is pollsters, and that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. All right, nuns as in N-O-N-E-S. None of the above is their answer. Now, what's astonishing about that, how many people today do you think, what percentage of the American population, when a pollster calls and says, what religious group are you affiliated with, what percentage of adults say none? 30, 40, 20? It's 19.5%. Now, what's really interesting about that is, in 2007, it was 15% gave that answer. So just in 5 years, it's grown from 15% to almost 20% of the American population. Now, who do you think these folks are, if you were to hazard a guess? Who do you think they are kind of demographically? Anybody else? Yes. And you obviously, you've seen this. Okay. It is what the sociologists call generational replacement. Is those of us who are baby boomers and our parents age and move further towards the end of our lives, the generation of our children and grandchildren that come along behind us, they are the ones who are increasingly expressing this none of the above. And it's very interesting to see who they are. There's a survey coming out next week. Now, this is an embargoed survey, so technically I'm not supposed to share this with you, so I can't tell you where it's from, or they would hunt me down and do bad things to me. But I can give you kind of a top-line description. This is the most thorough, systematic examination of this cohort of none of the aboves. And let me just read you some of this, and if you have any, I'd love to get your reaction to this. Among the youngest, the millennials, as they call themselves, people 18 to 22 years old, fully 1/3 are religiously unaffiliated, 33%. So that's the bubble. And as they age, it'll be fascinating to see what happens to them when they have kids, when they have grandkids. Do they come back, or do they continue? And what happens when their children hit adulthood? If you grow up in an unchurched household, my hunch is the odds are you're not going to find yourself in church because you didn't see that modeled in the household that you grew up with. Now, even in terms of people who are baby boomers like I am, in Generation X, the number of religiously unaffiliated in that demographic have also ticked up as well. So it's not just the young, but it's also those of us who can no longer claim to be young. The number of unaffiliated in my demographic is also going up, but not as rapidly as the younger generation. Now, what's interesting is many of these people have, in fact, grown up in a religious household. Some have, some have not, but most of them have, in fact, had some religious experience. In fact, a dear friend of mine who is a pollster says, if we ask him in a survey, what's your religious affiliation? And they say, well, none. If you come back at the end of the survey and come back to that question and say, no, come on, really, what are you? People will say, well, okay, I'm Methodist, because they went to Methodist church as a kid. So it's not that they're anti-religious. They actually have, a majority of them have a positive view of religion. It's just not for them. Okay, and they may have had a bit of religion over the course of their childhood, but they no longer see that it's relevant to their adulthood and to their life world. This is going to be the most interesting thing to watch, I think, as we go in the future in our society, is to see what's happening with those folk. Now, let me put on my church hat for just a moment, which actually we ethicists do from time to time. How should we respond as a church if we know that 1/3 of kids 18 to 22 are saying, I have no religious affiliation, and that number is growing year by year? How should we respond as a church? I'm curious. I mean, I have my own ideas, but I'm just curious, how does that hit you? We need to figure out why. And how would we do that? Yes, sir. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. No, I'm not saying if you're not in church, you're an immoral person. Not saying that at all. Not saying that at all. But I am saying it's hard to impart Christian ethics to people who are no longer part of the Christian church. Now, I'm not saying they're immoral. I mean, some of the most moral people I know are the most deeply atheist people I know. So I'm not going there. Some of the most deeply moral people I know are some of my Muslim neighbors. So I'm not saying if you're not a Christian, if you're Jewish or you're Muslim, you're immoral. I'm not arguing that at all. But I am thinking in terms of, as a Christian ethicist, as somebody who's interested in commending the Christian moral life to people, we now seem to be at a very interesting institutional point where we're losing a generation. So that's where I'm going. Okay, does that help? Well, I mean, it's not a competition. I'm sorry if I portrayed it that way, but I am saying, which I'm actually going to get to in a minute at the end, that part of the role of the church is, in fact, to commend the Christian moral life. Now, people may take it, people may leave it, and that's fine. But if, as a church, we decide it's not important to train the children who grow up in our churches with the Christian moral life, then they're certainly not going to embrace it when they get to adulthood. That's really what I'm saying. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, did everybody hear what Aldo was saying? I mean, he was saying basically we need to ask them why. And then we have to actually deal with the answer. Say more about that.
I don't think they can even answer why. Because I think if I were going to structure a survey, what I'd want to know is what this person's attitudes are now towards religion.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know what their parents' attitudes were like and how much exposure they got from their parents growing up,
Mm-hmm.
whether it was a lot, whether it was little, and then their grandparents. Because I feel that there's probably
Right.
an evolution generationally
Right.
where they started to move away from the church.
Well, it is also true now, most adult Americans who are involved in religion choose their religion. In other words, inherited religion is frankly virtually defunct in America today.
And I think part of that started to change back in the 60s. You know, personally, my own opinion,
Uh-huh.
because I think at that point, the parenting of children changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
When I grew up, I was given certain strict rules, and
Right.
you know, my parents tried to instill their values in me.
Right.
The school supported that because there was still prayer in the schools and singing Christmas carols and all of that. And
Right.
so changing the laws, the evolution of the laws, changing technology,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in terms of all that's available to everybody now in terms of knowledge and information is
Right.
exponential.
Okay.
But we have to be adaptive.
We have to.
The church has to be adaptive to this. If you make a cookie mold and they're not making cookies anymore, you have to look at that mold.
Right. Right. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Right. Now, I remember a conversation I had with my son when he turned 15. He said, Dad, I don't want to go to church anymore. And you know, the 15-year-old male mind is a kind of a scary thing. I mean, I'll just sort of say that out loud. And, you know, they hit 30 and things begin to settle down, I hear, but we haven't reached that point yet. But so, you know, he thought he was going to get a rise out of me. And he used to be able to get a rise out of me in a lot of subjects, but at least this time I saw this train coming before it hit me. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, because the church is full of hypocrites. And I said, you know, that's a very profound insight on your part, and you're dead right. And I plead guilty to that. Now, that disarmed him for about 10 seconds, okay? And he recovered very quickly. But I think what he was pointing to was that the community we were part of at that point, we all projected a perfect image, okay? And let's just be honest, we're all hypocrites at one time or another. And he saw that, but he felt like the community we were part of couldn't admit that as part of our own identity. And he just, you know, he couldn't fully wrap his arms around. And I essentially told him, I said, that's a profound insight. Guess what? That's going to remain true, whether you're in the church or not in the church. The church will be full of hypocrites, but so will the streets. But I think you're right. We need to listen, but listening is hard when they're not here. You know, I mean, it's easy to say, well, they don't agree with me when I've never had a conversation with them and I have no intention of having, whoever them happens to be. So it's easy to castigate folks who are not immediately at hand. And if it requires energy on my part to actually go and talk and then actually listen and process and adapt, that's just a lot of work. And I think, frankly, the reason churches don't do that is because it is a lot of work. And we might actually hear things that tell us we need to modify, we need to change. And churches, I mean, I love my social scientist friends. They're brilliant people. But I'm not going to go to my 23-year-old son now with a survey saying, you know, could you please fill this out? And I promise you I will take the results to heart. You know, that we need a deeper form of discourse and conversation that a social scientific survey is not going to breed and build the kind of conversation that we need. But now here's where some of my friends in the Methodist Church get particularly exercised, is they think we're going extinct and we have to do this to survive. And I'm not a survivalist, okay? I'm not saying we have to go out there and talk to people who've left us, because if we don't, we're going to disappear. That's a lousy reason. I need a deeper and better reason, maybe because I love these folks and they love me. And maybe out of a sense of compassion and love and service, maybe I'll have the conversation, not because I'm self-interested that my church may go out of business if I don't do it. And so sometimes churches get too geared up and spun up about, we have to do this to survive, because survival is the most important thing. I think the most important thing is, are we loving our neighbor as ourselves? You know, we're called to love the neighbor. We're not called to love the age. So I get nervous when these discussions then begin to tip over into, we have to do this or the Methodist Church is going to disappear. Maybe God wants it to disappear. It's H. Richard Niebuhr, one of my favorite theologians we're going to talk about in a minute, said, before there can be resurrection, there has to be crucifixion. And we don't like thinking about that in terms of our churches. We want it to be all smooth sailing and kind of a nice, healthy growth curve. But the reality is, this new generation, this generation of millennials, are looking at what a lot of us are doing, and they're saying, that is not for me. And it's so easy to blame them without doing the real critical self-examination, that maybe there are things we need to be doing differently that speaks a more effective and relevant word to their lives. If I were in charge of the universe, and I'm not, which is actually a good thing, I would want to spend more time listening and to find out what forms of community these folks are desiring but not finding in the churches of today. I would want to invest more energy in trying to discern what it is that we are doing and not doing that perhaps inhibits their attraction of what we are. And if it turns out we do all that and we try the best we can and they still stay away, then it is what it is. But I think we're in a very interesting time now where our children are confronting this very complex world morally, and they really think the church morally is back in kind of the dark ages, and we're inflexible, and we're not cutting edge, and we're not relevant to the moral dilemmas that they face. And if that's the case, then shame on us, not shame on them. Because as I said, they have grown up facing an extraordinarily complex set of external and internal circumstances that are so profoundly different and more difficult than what I faced when I was in their shoes at 16 through say 22. So I don't fault them. Anything, I fault the church for not being adaptive and being interested enough to spend the resources and the time asking the questions and having the hard conversation and actually honoring and processing the feedback that we get, that our answers may be too simple, that our answers may be wrong, and that we don't take them seriously enough. So that's one free sermon for tonight, okay? I tend to fall into this sort of homiletical style from time to time. But all this is to simply say that this group of this generation is really worth paying very close attention to. Let me commend to you another book, and we're running out of time, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into it. There's a remarkable book called American Grace, written by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. The subtitle is How Religion Divides and Unites Us. And they have a long section here on these so-called nuns, and they study them in great depth and try to understand what it is that makes them tick. If you're the parent of someone either in this cohort or about to enter into that cohort, I think you'll find these kinds of discussions very interesting. Now, I told you this survey was embargoed, but if you watch the news and you see a survey, it'll probably be in the newspapers next week, about the Pew Forum research, read that, okay, and go to their website, and you might find some interesting stuff there about this group of people. And so the reason I ask it is, here's a group of folk who've grown up in this supernova era of just astonishing choices. I think of my own daughter who graduated last June from Oakton High School. A lot of kids in this church grow up at Oakton High School. All the world's religions are represented at her lunch table. You look at any soccer team in CYA soccer, okay, and there you see the pluralism of of Northern Virginia. And it's a wonderful thing. I actually believe we could solve world peace if we just had everybody on a soccer team like they have at CYA. Okay? Because you learn how to play and get along and respect. Kids who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Buddhist, who are Hindu, who are nothing. And they shake hands at the end, and it's really kind of scary to watch girls play soccer too. I mean, I had the stereotypical illusion that they always played nicely all the time until my daughter came home with a concussion. And I realized, something else is going on here. But at the end of the game, they shake hands, and they go to Red Robin to have a Coke or whatever. So there is actually something to soccer, frankly, that religion has not been able to capture, about how to get along. And the public schools have found a way to create lunchrooms where these people have lunch together and they're best friends. And so in many ways, the world is ahead of us as a church many times on how to get along and how to deal with this diversity. Now, I want to segue into this last section, and we can maybe move into more conversation here. Let me give you 4 Christian options in the face of this moral complexity. I want to run through them very quickly, and let's have the discussion. Now, let me give you a caveat here. I have a degree in international security. I took kind of a detour in my ethical training and did kind of a bombs and bullets master degree. And one of the things we learned to do, we had to write decision memos for the President of the United States. Now, this was actually during the end of the Cold War. And so you would come down, those of you who've seen decision memos for politicians, you talk about the problem, you analyze it. In the end, you give the president a series of choices. And the first option was always in the world, with nuclear Armageddon. That was choice number 1, Mr. President. And choice number 2 was always unilateral disarmament. And then option number 3 was always, of course, your own wise answer that clearly was self-evidently right. Now, I'm actually kind of doing that here on my list of options, so I apologize ahead of time. The first option is a version of the one that Mr. McIntyre gave, and that's what I call the sectarian option. That says in the face of all this disorder and complexity and disagreement over fundamental moral issues, all the church should do is just hunker down and wait for all this noise to pass us by, and then maybe in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, we'll all come back together and celebrate the fact that this little Christian group was right. Now, I actually grew up in a sectarian Christian community that sort of espoused a version of that. In this small little town I grew up, in the strange part of the world where I grew up, there were people in my community who thought that our denomination were the only Christians. Okay. Now, you scratch that a little bit and you realize pretty fast that's a fairly pretentious worldview, right? That this little group of people living in a kind of a backwoodsy place like we did, that somehow we were right and everybody else was wrong. But there was kind of a comfort from that. It simplified the world to say, if you agree with me, you're in the right. If you disagree with me, you're in the wrong. And the world was literally divided between black and white, and there was no gray. I don't know, somewhere along the age of 9 or 10, that began to break down, because in my extended families, we had all flavors and varieties of religious folk, and I just couldn't quite say that my aunts Mabel and Gertrude were going to hell because they were Methodists. It didn't correspond to the reality of the lived lives I saw. But this has been a powerful option in the history of Christianity. It's just to sort of roll the sidewalks up and play the Christian game within the confines, the physical confines of church, and not worry about all the complexity out there. You simplify it, but simply saying, we're right, they're wrong, and that's the way it is. The second option is what I call let 1,000 flowers bloom. This is the option that says, deep down, all religions are the same at their core. You just see different expressions of things on the periphery. Now, this is actually a very powerful view, and it goes back to the Enlightenment era. And it's been, if I heard that once, I heard it 1,000 times growing up. I still hear it today from my students. Now, at the first level, that's kind of insulting to people of different religious views. To say, you don't know this, but let me tell you that underneath the varieties of faith, you're all really the same. Now, I don't know about you, but when somebody comes and tells me I don't fully understand my own religion, and I'm trying to disabuse you of this illusion that somehow you're different from other folk, and underneath it all, you're the same. Now think about that. It's hard for me to believe that Mother Teresa, Osama bin Laden, and L. Ron Hubbard, just to pick three random people that they all share the same core experience of religion, and they're just simply different expressions of the same human impulse or capacity. I don't think that's true. But that is kind of comforting to say it doesn't really matter the difference, but underneath it all, we're all kind of the same and all religions are alike. Now, I don't think that bears real scrutiny when you begin to look. In other words, I don't want to say that a member of the Church of the Aryan Nation is equivalent to, say, Mother Teresa. Okay, I just don't think that holds up when we look. But it is a comforting option for many people. Now, the third option is what I call the hegemonic Christian option. You know, growing up in the South as I did, and some of you may relate to this, there was that old saying, you know, save your Confederate money, boys, the South shall rise again. Okay, there's a Christian version of this that says, hey, we may have fallen out of control in favor in American society. We don't necessarily control the halls of Congress and the Supreme Court like we used to, but the day is coming when we'll be put back in power. And it'll be a great day when Christians run the world again. Now, again, some mainline Protestants I know act as if it's still 1950 and the rest of the country will still come to us to solve the world's problems first because we're just so much smarter and better looking than the rest of the world. Well, guess what? That's not true. Mainline Protestants are down to somewhere between 15 and 16% of the American population. So don't hang on to that Confederate money because it's not coming back anytime soon. So this sort of hegemonic, we're going to get back in there someday dream doesn't really seem to be helpful. Okay, now I've told you how to end the world. I've told you how to do unilateral surrender. Let me talk about what the last option I want to try and commend to you, and then I'll shut up and we'll have a conversation. Let me read to you a very interesting little paragraph from this guy, H. Richard Niebuhr, I mentioned earlier. He wrote this back, I think, in the 1940s. The chapter is called The Story of Our Life. The preaching of the early Christian church was not an argument for the existence of God, nor an admonition to follow the dictates of some common human conscience, unhistorical and super-social in character. It was primarily a simple recital of the great events connected with the historical appearance of Jesus Christ and a confession of what had happened to the community of disciples. Whatever it was that the church meant to say, whatever was revealed or manifested to it could be indicated only in connection with an historical person and events in the life of his community. The confession referred to history and was consciously made in history. So think about this. The first Christians didn't argue over against the Zoroastrians or the cult of Isis, or you name all the pagan cults that they were surrounded by. They didn't systematically go through and write books showing, here are the 25 errors of the cult of Isis in Egypt. Instead, they told their story about what God had done for them. And the Christians saw themselves as embedded in the larger narrative of God's relationship to Israel. So it was inconceivable to them that they could tell their story apart from the story of the history of the Jews, of which they saw themselves as a fundamental part. Now, the history of Judaism and Christianity is very, very complex going forward, but they saw themselves as connected to that same God, and they believed that God had come in the form of Jesus Christ as well. They simply told people the story of what they believed, what they'd heard, and what they'd seen. And they didn't cram it down anybody's throat. They didn't try to expose the errors of other forms of thinking. Their world was just as pluralistic, if not more so, than ours is in terms of ethics. And we detect no anxiety in the New Testament that they're not in charge. We detect no anxiety that there are a million different options of ethics and belief in that world, and they're just one of thousands. The way they responded to a similar kind of pluralism was simply to say, we have a story to tell. We are, as one theologian today has called it, the church is a story-formed community. The reason we are here is because we're a group of people who've heard and believed this same story. And in fact, we think we're now incorporated into that ongoing story. So it's an unapologetic, non-defensive Christian view that begins with the biblical story. Now, they knew it, and we should know it inside and out because it's our story. So I hope it means if you visit Flores over time, you hear that story. Think about the preaching that goes on in this church. You think about what Tom does and what Barbara does and what Tim do, that over time we hear the biblical story repeated. So that if you're a stranger who's never heard this story and you spend time in our midst, just as a casual observer, you hear and learn that story. There's nothing more frustrating than to dip into a community on a regular basis and after 6 months say, I have no idea what these people are doing here. I have no idea what they believe. If folks are alienated and they spend time in our community and they don't hear this sort of fundamental story of Scripture, they're going to leave and say, that's a very strange group of people that get together 4 or 5 times a weekend at Flores. I have no idea why they're there. But the good news is we live, at least in this church, where we do, in fact, proclaim that story in its various pieces and parts over time. So that the curious person can come in and say, okay, I get it now. I understand some of the basics of this because over the course of 6, 7, 12 months, I have heard that story. And even more specifically, we celebrate things like communion, which is really the heart of our story. And again, we see that reenacted, we hear it proclaimed. If you come to the 5 o'clock service, as I tend to do, you hear that every week, which is a good thing. So that no matter how good or bad the sermon might be or how good or bad the music might be, you do have a moment where you hear that central part of our story proclaimed and reenacted and reflected on. And we get up and we have to go down forward and participate and kind of get involved in the retelling of the drama of that story. So we are at Flores a story-formed community, and our belief is this story shapes who we are and makes a difference about how we engage in the world. Now, we're going to talk more about that in 2 weeks when we talk about sanctification. So the beginning then of Christian ethics is not discussing how Christian ethics relates to different philosophical schools of ethics, even though that's interesting, and I do that professionally. That's not where we begin the discussion. We begin the discussion with what we think God has done through Jesus Christ and the difference that makes in our lives. That's the beginning point of Christian ethics. And at the heart of that story is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So being deeply schooled in the biblical story, we seek to become a community of character shaped by the work of the Holy Spirit to become holy people called to love our neighbors, not our age, but to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. Now then, how do we move out beyond this community? See, in my sectarian community, we were great. If you were inside the bubble, we would give you the shirt off our back. But if you weren't, then we'd step over you in the parking lot. Okay, what's wrong with that picture? There were a lot of people in our parking lot. There were more people beyond our parking lot that we stepped over. There weren't that many of us inside the bubble. It was kind of easy to take care of our brothers and sisters who were right here. The tough question is then, how do we relate to people who maybe don't believe what we believe, or maybe even believe what we believe is kind of dumb or stupid? I think then we move in faith into the world, confident that God's equipped us to be the people God would have us to be. This movement into the world is one of love and service, modeling the holy life of those around us. We don't seek to dominate. We're not seeking to conquer anybody, but we are seeking opportunities to love folks, to suffer with them, and try to spread the good gifts of God around to people who are in need of some of those gifts. We then look to partner with other people of goodwill by discerning whether or not they're moving in some of the same directions as the kingdom of God. This is how we relate to non-Christian groups. If we see people doing things that are analogous to what we think the kingdom of God is about, we'll partner with them. Frankly, regardless of the label on their community or even their lack of community. So this calls us, first of all, to know what the direction of the kingdom of God is on the one hand, and it calls for an ability to discern the direction that other people are going in a way that isn't threatened by them. We have to be skilled in both. We have to understand the kingdom of God, but we also have to understand where other people are headed and not be paranoid about partnering with them, but confident that God's empowered us to help improve and change the world, even with folks who may not come within 1,000 miles of what we actually believe, but are doing some of the things we think are right. Now, having said that, I think any partnerships Christians form have to be temporary, ad hoc. I have a political friend in town who says, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. And I kind of like that. I mean, it works for them in the political world. I think that ought to work for the church, too. Because on the one hand, we've seen what happens when Christians form a permanent alliance with, say, the government. All we have to do is go back to the middle of the last century, and we see what happened when German Christians of various stripes formed an eternal covenant with National Socialism and said, to be truly Christian means you have to be a German in that form. And we have millions of deaths as a result of that, where Christians willingly participated in genocide, thinking that it was the will of God that they do so. And very few Christians smart enough and attentive enough to say, that's a mistake. So we have this parable. It's not a parable, it's a reality in our past that says we have to be careful who we partner with. And the big theological mistake there was where the church formed a permanent alliance and said, to be really Christian, you have to be really German, and you have to support the Fuhrer. And they did unspeakable things to Jews, to gypsies, to gays, to the handicapped, and other groups of people. And that's the error so we should be very careful about forming any kind of permanent alliance. Always be willing to renegotiate and rethink our relationship. Instead, I think we move confidently into the world, not intimidated because we're not in charge, not afraid for our safety or purity, but like the Son of God, we come to serve, not to be served. We are not dismayed that the world may no longer look at our brand of Christianity first, if at all, when solving the world's problems. We still do what God's called us to do, despite the fact that we may not be in charge of the universe anymore. So let me give you a quick list of tasks of the church, and I'll stop, as I've been promising for the last 15 minutes. I'll do it for real this time, and then we'll spend the balance of our time fielding any of your questions. I think number one task of the church is what we used to call catechesis. Now, that's one of those $10 theological words that I love. It means we train people in what it is to be Christian. We spend some time reflecting, well, if you claim to be a Christian, this is kind of what it looks like. This is what you're supposed to do. So we have Sunday school. We have Alpha. We have Disciple Bible. We do events like this where we reflect on what does it mean to be a Christian in a complex world. Secondly, we model authentic discipleship inside and outside the church. The problem with my sectarian model I talked about is that people were we were fantastic Christians from about 9 a.m. till noon on Sunday mornings. We got out there in the business world, we cheated, we lied, we did whatever it took to be successful. And that was okay because we came back on Sunday mornings and sang the songs of Zion and everybody was cool. Our discipleship has to match, our rhetoric has to match the lived reality. Thirdly, I think we have to deploy our wealth in a Christ-like fashion. To me, this is the central challenge of the Western church today. What are we going to do with our wealth? John Wesley said, if you have 3 meals a day, a roof over your head, and anything left over, you're rich by biblical standards. I hate that. I want to tear that page out of the sermons of John Wesley because that gets me every time. Because it makes it impossible for me to deny the fact I'm rich when I want to rationalize it 1,000 different ways. Fourthly, it means we live peaceably as far as is possible within our means. Next, we reject despair and we engender hope. Christians are to be a community of hopeful people. Then we are to be flexible and accountable, true communities where somebody stands up and says, Shawn, you're making a big mistake. I hope I live in this community and I have enough friends here where if I do really dumb stuff from a moral perspective, somebody in this church will love me enough to pull me aside and say, Shawn, you're doing dumb stuff. Do you know it? But that kind of true community is hard to do. And lastly, and this may be the hardest part for Christians in Northern Virginia, we have to trust in God and not in ourselves and not in our resumes. Okay? And I'm the worst offender. In the academic, my wife is in business, and her credo is you have to have your CV, your resume, on one page. Okay? Now, in the academic world, you get laughed out of the room if your CV is only one page. You write down every time you sneeze in front of more than 2 people. Okay? I have academic friends whose CVs are 40, 50, 60 pages long. We measure it by weight and by volume in my world, okay? And so we come to Northern Virginia, and it makes us go crazy, okay? But we're not saved by our resumes. We're empowered by our trust in God, not because we're just the smartest people that have ever come together. All right, I'm going to shut up at that point. I've been all over the map. Questions, reactions, responses? Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question. I don't feel comfortable dismissing out of hand the let 1,000 flowers bloom scenario.
Right.
You use the extremes of Mother Teresa and Osama bin Laden, but what if you look at Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Buddha, and you see that people trying to be their best selves in their own religious context.
Right.
And I think it even fits with when you talk about we have our own story as Christians, but I think we have to acknowledge that Muslims have their own story.
Absolutely.
And so why can't we both have our own story and believe in it and know it's real and live it, but also accept that other religions have their own stories? And it's not that we're telling other religions, oh, we're all the same. It's we're acknowledging that we can only really fully know our own religion, and we can't proclaim to understand or know your full story.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's a very important distinction. I hope I clarified. It is to say that Gandhi, Buddha, and Mother Teresa. What I would say, what I'm critiquing is the person who says at their core they believe and act out of the same impulses. I think that's disrespectful for the difference that's there. They are deeply spiritual people. There are, in fact, overlaps in their behaviors and teaching, but I would say that it's not correct or permissible to say that at the core you scratch away all their particularity and context away and you have the same thing going on. To me, that's paternalistic. And that in fact implies if I make that claim, I have a view of themselves that they do not share. Now, having said that, I totally agree with you. They have their own stories. And I have no God's eye view that says, well, God loves you better than that one, or this one is better than that one. All I can do is say that as a Christian, and given my understanding of what God is, this is who I want to be. And so I'm happy to relate and cooperate with, as I said later, with people of goodwill going in similar directions. I completely agree with that. But I just think it's a little presumptuous for me to say that even those 3 people are just variant expressions of the same human impulse or condition that we call religion. So I'm not being I think it's disrespectful to say that. And if you've had conversations with folks of deeply held religious belief that's different from your own, and you try to sell that line, that, well, underneath it we're really agreeing and we're having the same kind of experience here, most of my friends of different religions look at me and say, you're out of your mind. And how dare you presume to speak for me? And I don't want to do that. And given, I guess the last point I say, well, given some of the diversity, I think you're right, I did pick extreme cases, but those are real cases. And I'm just not willing to correlate every religious person and every religious option as somehow underneath it as being the same and equivalent. So I don't know if I'm making clear. I mean, I grant your point. Religious pluralism is real. It is not illusory. But I think this notion that at the core we're all expressing the same thing but just in different fashions really disrespects ultimately the differences that exist between some of these traditions. So that's why I'm just really hesitant. But now, that is a very powerful view, and many people have held it, particularly in the West, since kind of the beginning of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. So there are a lot of people who would look at me and say, Shawn, you're out of your mind, and I'm used to hearing that actually from people. But no, your point is dead on. I agree with that. So thank you. I hope that. Yes, sir.
Your, I guess, 4th option, you painted a picture of Christianity, the grew out of the biblical tradition. But many scholars now are looking at that, and, instead of like Christianity growing up like a big oak tree and then branches, it's more like a banyan tree.
More like what?
A banyan tree.
A banyan tree. Okay.
And that, Christianity started out more diverse than maybe that simple story that you talked about really is. What do you think?
Yeah, I would. On the one hand, I think that's right, but I would argue, certainly in terms of Scripture, that there is a narrative structure to Scripture that I would defend, both in terms of the Christian Bible, but also the Hebrew Bible as well. Now, you're right. The risk is that I flatten that and I oversimplify it, which is not my intention. But I do believe that, as Niebuhr was pointing out, you look at both the four Gospels, you look at the book of Acts, which is actually by volume the majority of the New Testament. It is a narrative structure of the life of Jesus, and of course then in Acts, the life of the early church. Now, the earliest pieces of Scripture we have in the New Testament are from the Apostle Paul, whose story and narrative we know from the book of Acts. So I would actually defend this notion of a story-formed community. And the first stories that the first Christians told were, in fact, the stories of the Hebrew Bible. So I would argue, I think Niebuhr is a smart enough and sophisticated guy. He taught at Yale, right? So he has to be brilliant. That he understood the complexity of the history of both the biblical tradition but early Christianity as well. So I think you can hold to that view that there is a biblical tradition while not denying the historical complexity that you talk about. So in other words, I'm not trying to sell, Methodism is like the only Christian option or anything like. If you're hearing me say that, that's not what I'm selling at all. But I do think most Christians throughout the history of the Christian church have understood this kind of biblically formed, biblically shaped notion. Now, that's played out radically differently in different cultural and historical contexts, I would gather. So, I take your point, and I don't want to come off as saying trying to kind of reduce the history of the church to some kind of flat, narrow view. But I do believe that one can defend the argument that we are to be a story-formed community. And if you grow up in a Christian tradition that somehow no longer spends time learning the complexity of that story, that community does not have a very long shelf life. And, maybe people want to contest that. But so I think it is a fundamental task of the church today to, in fact, be reliving, retelling, rethinking that biblical story in all of its complexity. And I just think the church gets into trouble when it moves too far away from that task and that notion. Question over here.
You were talking about the benefits your children get from going to Oakton and the multicultural community. My high school was actually very much like that. I played on those soccer teams, and now my kids are at Westfield in that similar thing. And while I see the great benefits, the issue I have and the concern in trying to be a Christian is that because my basic worldview was so steeped in multiculturalism, it is very, very difficult to say, this is what I believe, this is right.
Right.
And I think that's one of the issues the church has is like, especially here, our children are seeing all of this and like, well, how are you, are you sure you're right?
Right.
You don't have evidence.
Right.
And I think that we need to make a point as a church well, no, I'm agreeing we can't be intolerant of others, of being stronger in our message.
Right.
And it's a very difficult thing here. I get a lot of very negative feedback from people for being strong on the Christian message. Right. And I'm also then trying to help my children. How do you give them a strong message that then meshes with what they're seeing in their high school life?
Oh, no, I completely agree with that. And this is where I hinted at some things in that list at the end. Jesus calls us to literally love our neighbor as ourselves. Okay, now I can do that. It doesn't say find out what they believe and find out about their ethnicity and find out about their country of origin and then figure out how to love them. Or if you're going to, it just says love the person in need who's near you, which is very demanding Okay, it means I have to find out how to love the Muslim family 2 townhouses down. And I discovered, I'll just tell you a quick story. We moved into a townhouse 13 years ago. My then 6-year-old daughter said, I've made a new friend. I played with Lily today in the kind of out in front. And then the next day, Lily's mother came and knocked on the door. And I opened it up. And she says, hi, I am such and such El Said. And your daughter has met my daughter Lily. They play together. And your daughter has graciously invited Lily to come in and play. And she said, I think that's great, but I have one question for you. And I thought, wow, what is this going to be? And you know what she asked me? She said, do you have a gun in your house? And I thought, that is a fabulous question. I've let my children play in other people's houses. I have never asked that question. And I actually, given my own personal story, have a thing about guns, which I'm not pushing, but but I've never asked anybody. And I told her, I said, well, actually, no, we don't. But thank you for asking. And I was convicted because this Muslim woman asked just a really good question about her daughter going over to a stranger but a new kid's house. And she was worried about the safety of her kid. And she didn't know me from a hole in the ground. And that was the last question I expected from her. So I do actually learn something from her. And we developed a relationship between her kids and our kids that it went into soccer, actually. Their dad ended up coaching Sarah's soccer team. So I think at the heart of the Christian message is we are called to love the person close to us in physical proximity. And I hate that. Because I want to choose. I want to help and love the people I like and who are nice to me and who maybe think and look like I do. I have all these defaults and prejudices. So the good news is, living in Northern Virginia, we are called to love an astonishing array of people. But we don't have to abandon what we believe in doing that. I completely agree with you. I think I guess if I could describe it, is the Christian community should be, in a sense, a community with a porous border, okay? That anybody should feel welcome in our midst, regardless of their religious commitments or lack of religious. We ought to respect and love, and that doesn't mean I have to zip my mouth and I can't express my own views. Now we do live in an era where there are folks sometimes who are frustrated when somebody expresses opinions or orientations different than ours. I mean, I get that. We have to be careful because because of difference, there's sometimes conflict. I don't want to minimize that. That's very real. And I have tremendous respect for public school officials who have to navigate the religious pluralism of our world today in Northern Virginia. I mean, it's astonishing, the diversity. And when you think about, I know a woman who's a principal in elementary school, and they have something like 42 different languages spoken in an elementary school. And there are probably these 42 different religious expressions, lived religion in that community. And trying to navigate that just makes me dizzy to think about. So I take your point. I think the church needs to be able to tell its story, but we need to act it out so that a person can look at us and say, that Flores church, they're a loving group of people. They have compassion for people in need. Now, they may believe some doctrines I have trouble with and maybe will never embrace, but at the end of the day, they show up at Hutchinson Elementary School. They tutor people. They feed people in Sierra Leone. If you walk in the door and say, I need help, they're not going to ask you. They're not going to do a background check on you before they help you. So I think we actually do a pretty good job of that balance here at Flores. Tom preaches the gospel in a very powerful and loving way, but it's not an intolerant way. It's not a fearful way, but it's one that engages the world. And Jesus just seems to have this capacity to go across the astonishing diversity of Palestinian life in the first century. And with maybe one or two exceptions, he doesn't get torqued because of the diversity that he encounters. He seems to have this capacity of openness, and he doesn't compromise who he is or what he's doing, but he has a capacity to love the person in front of him. And to me, that's the key. If at the end of the day, if my theology prevents me from loving the person in need who comes across my screen, then something's wrong with my theology. So I don't know, that's a long, wandering, meandering answer to a very, very good question and observation. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Take the opportunity. As Christians, we're taught to be and encouraged to be disciples. In being disciples, especially in other countries, we are invariably in conflict with the existing religions there, the existing moral code, probably made up from that religion, I would think. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What kind of conflicts does it create?
I'm not sure what the antecedent of it is. I mean, just the fact.
Okay, we go to Africa. Areas in Africa have their own religions. They have their own moral codes. The moral codes are relatively similar to ours. It's probably love thy neighbor and don't treat other people as you wouldn't want treat people as you would want to be treated as well.
Mm-hmm.
We go in there and say we're better. We got this code. We have this Savior that we believe in. We think you should believe in it too.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of problems does that create?
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, Africa is where the church, the
I'll
Christian
take that
church
to China then,
is
make it
exploding.
more difficult.
Well, in China, the Christian church is exploding. It's interesting that in the South and in the East, Christianity is actually growing rapidly. I think we're going to see in our lifetime a wave of missionaries coming back to America from places like China, Korea, and Africa, frankly. And I've seen this. I've seen it on the Boston Common. I've heard Spanish-speaking preachers from Salvador and other places evangelizing pagan America. So at one level, it's always been this way. I mean, except maybe for Europe, and of course now Christianity is almost dead in Europe because everybody was a Christian. It's just what I call or what one scholar calls the fact of pluralism. The truth is, you don't have to go very far anywhere in the globe and you're going to find different worldviews, different theological and religious worldviews. I'm not anxious about that. I mean, I think if you look at the world of Christianity in the first century, they were this teeny tiny wacky minority from the backwoods of Palestine. And they didn't seem to be freaked out by the fact that they were the minority. So that kind of difference and conflict has been with Christianity from the beginning. I don't see it going away. And even though it may make us uncomfortable at times, I do believe we know how to be church in the face of that kind of conflict and diversity. We are over time. There's actually a very interesting discussion that 60 million of us are going to be watching at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to stop now. And we'll be back next week to talk about the ethics of war and peace from a Christian perspective. Thank you so much. It's been a great discussion.